very hard, and so we're going to hear lots more about it. When Tim is not monitoring plastic pollution, he's an avid rock climber, boulderer, cyclist, and he's also taken to open water swimming. I've just counted, he's swam in more lakes in Nova Scotia than I've had hot dinners. And I think that's probably part of your strategy to monitor plastic pollution. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Tim.
Thanks so much, Tony. Thank you. Wow, I never got such an epic intro. I hope I can live up to expectations now. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Bertram, as well, for setting up this whole meeting, this whole lecture. Yes, so let's skip to the second slide. This is me past Saturday. I was out at a small island in St. Margaret's Bay. Location remains undisclosed because they want to protect the island. And I've been doing plastic pollution research since 10 years now. So this is my most recent picture in action. I've always involved kids in my research, or at least use data produced by school children in my research. I'm from Germany and I work at an institution called Kieler Forschungswerkstatt, which roughly translates to Kiel Science Factory, which is the school lab of my home university. And that looks something like this. So school kids come in to do research or to be part of research. Yeah, you can see we have a nice working place right in the botanical garden of Kiel University. If you're ever there, feel free to reach out and I'll give you a tour. And then kids come in and use the microscopes, use sieving equipment, employ research methods. We have a nice creative corner, basically, where they can work on their own research projects. Yeah, and we also coordinate citizen science projects to involve them. Is everyone here familiar with the term citizen science? Really? All right. So citizen science is a kind of controversial term. It means that we involve people who don't identify as researchers themselves in research processes. But as you might imagine, the term citizen in itself is a bit controversial because not everybody identifies as a citizen. So for today's purpose, I will use the term citizen science, but just to make you aware that other people, for example, use community science. Or they just refer to it as collaborative research with the public. All right. I want to give you a really brief introduction to the plastic pollution problem. Yeah, but we have a big expert sitting here, so if there are really urgent questions, maybe Tony can help us answer them. I didn't want to bring a really horrible image of animals ingesting plastics or whales being entangled in plastics, because you probably have seen these already enough. So I brought you a small graph that I found in a highly cited research paper, and it kind of predicts how much plastic pollution there will be in the year of 2030 when we keep going as we are currently doing. So they develop different scenarios, 3 different scenarios. You see them here. There's the business as usual scenario. And currently, they estimate we emit about 20 million tons of plastic annually every year into the ocean from the land. That's quite a bit. And then they develop 3 scenarios. So the business as usual, we don't care, will get us to somewhere around 60 million tons, like at least tripling the amount. Then there's the ambitious scenario, which I think is an interesting word for this, because the line still goes up. So this is the scenario. If we keep on working like we do now, a lot of governments have enacted legislation on some plastic items. Here in Canada, plastic straws were forbidden, I think, plastic bags from supermarkets, at least, to give them out for free. So there is some action. So this is the term called ambitious. So currently we do ambitious legal action, basically, on this issue. Will still get us to somewhere around 35 million tons of pollution. So like twice the amount we currently have in the environment. And then there's the target scenario that would bring us down to 8 million tons. But even the authors of this study themselves say that this is too much, still too much of plastic pollution in the environment. So yeah, the authors conclude that despite the current effort to reduce this issue, it will likely at least double by 2030. This is just to give you briefly an input that it is an urgent issue, has been since decades, and will likely be an urgent issue still in the near to possibly really far future. All right, so let's talk about solutions. This is a modified version of the waste hierarchy. Have you heard of the waste hierarchy? Yeah, you have the expression reduce, reuse, recycle. You have probably heard reduction should come before reusing. Reusing should come before recycling. So this is basically an extended version of that. You have some more levels on that pyramid, basically on that waste hierarchy. And we already know that plastic recycling is basically not working. There is a research paper out there where they have modeled the efficiency of plastic recycling worldwide, and they concluded that about 9% of plastic waste is recycled, which basically, then I always raise the question, is it even worth it? Because, yeah, recycling infrastructure is really costly. It's only efficient in countries who put in a lot of money into these programs. So to get to 9%, yeah, we could discuss the if it's even worth to do that. So if we move up, we find things like reduction. How can we reduce things? We can, for example, forbid things. We can restrict the market, right? This is kind of a tricky issue because then we live in a free market economy, and you cannot just forbid certain materials or items just like that. But it has been done, for example, here in Canada with the straws, in Europe as well with the plastic straws, plastic cutlery, and some other items. And after this was enacted, I went to a German supermarket and found this. All right, the plastic cutlery is not plastic anymore, but it's now packaged in plastic still. So I don't think this is a solution. And today I want to explore with you a bit the educational component of this issue, but also, mixing it in with the research component. That's basically just the setup for the plastic pollution problem. So citizen science could look like this. Some kids go out and do research, right? And we have done this, and then this research transforms to scientific knowledge. And when I use the word transform, I mean like we go through the painful process of analyzing the data, publishing a study, and so on and so forth, that a lot of you are familiar with. And then the question I want to ask as well, can we use this scientific knowledge to do policy making or to involve the kids in policy making? So basically, these are the two big questions of today that I want to address with you. Here they are. Can school kids do research? And I want you to convince that you say yes afterwards. And the second question is, can we use the contribution of these citizen scientists, of these kids, to be used for policy making? And just as a spoiler, I'm not so sure about that. The first one I'm quite sure about. All right. When I talk to the kids, we often talk about what is research, what is science. Is it really research when they come into our school lab and do experiments, and I already know the outcome of the experiments? The teachers often tell them, oh yeah, that's how research works. You do this, you do that, and then you get to an outcome. I personally don't think that's a realistic representation of science. Or I've been doing my work wrong for the past 10 years. I'm not sure if some people are more on the straightforward path to success, but I usually have to fail quite often until I get where I want to be. Yes, and this is basically where you come in. Some of you will have a piece of paper and a pen in front of you. And this is an exercise I frequently do with my students. And maybe you have to share pen or paper. And I would invite you, if you're not a researcher, you can try to answer this question. If you're a researcher, and you're free to identify as a researcher today in this lecture if you want to, you can answer this question. And you can think of today, maybe you did something that you would consider research. Maybe just write down one short keyword what you think research involves. So one process can be like, oh, I went to my lab and analyzed something, or I worked on a research grant, or whatever. All right, I'll give you 1 minute, and the online audience is also welcome to participate. And if you want, you can also just post it in the chat. I had a really honest student once, and they wrote down, I tried to do research today, but I just drank coffee. So I don't ask you to share. You can keep it for yourself. But what I want you to do is look at what you've written down and think about if school kids could do the thing you just wrote down, and evaluate, yes, they could do it for sure, or like, oh, no way they can do it. Or maybe you have a middle category like, oh, if I could train them for an hour or two, if I could be with them and inform them a bit, could they possibly do that? Maybe you could briefly evaluate. And then I'm going to ask you, who is in the no category? No, school kids cannot do the thing I wrote down. One person, two, 1.5 maybe. Who's in the yes? For sure they can do it. Okay, half of the people. And who is in the yeah, but maybe let's get some education in there, some training. Couple of people, okay. Right. I usually do this exercise and then we really put the papers in the location and analyze them after. I won't do this today, but yeah, that's a nice exercise to do with the students when you ask them about what research is about. Also, the university students is a great thing to do what they imagine the public or school kids can take part in. So this is maybe a fair question. Why do we even want to involve school kids in research? Is there benefit? I believe so. So the more egoistic benefit is I can send out a lot of kids out there and they do my work. And then I get nice research data, right? And I don't have to do this work. And I don't have to be in all the locations at once. But there are a couple other reasons. So a couple other reasons relate to knowing about science, knowing about research, maybe imagining themselves as becoming researchers. For some people, maybe the researcher is some crazy person in the lab with a lab coat and they cannot imagine themselves as a researchers. And we have the hope that by involving them in the research process, that we can open up this possibility a bit to them. Yeah, when we work with them on the plastic topic, they also become plastic pollution experts. No, they know how much there is when they go out there. They are probably the only people who have ever analyzed it in a systematic way at the site. They know. And then there are reasons more related to environmental awareness and changing our world. So when the kids go home, yeah, I think a lot of them would talk about their experience with their parents. We don't know what they are talking about, but they likely share some of the insights, spread the word, and maybe also through social media, though I don't think it's really cool to post about plastic pollution research projects when you're in school, but some of them might do that. Yeah, and maybe we can in the end have enough influence on policymakers to make a difference. So that's the why. And now let me see the how. So these are some 24 little researchers. On the left, that's me. So I've been out with this school, Kühner Junior High School at Williams Lake. This was the first school who I have involved here in this project. Yeah, and we went to the lake really close to their school and did a small research project with them. I'll tell you about the results in a second. So I've repeated that with 7 other schools, and so far there were about 220 kids who were participating. Quite young kids from the age of 10 to 12, roughly. Really brave researchers. There you see a rainy day out. We were lucky to have the structure there, so we could do some data collection there. Yeah, some of them got frostbite, according to them, during that day. I hope they didn't. Well, and then on the right you see some data collection efforts. So I've been out with 2 schools and also 2 volunteer groups from Let's Talk Science and from the St. Margaret's Bay Stewardship Association. And I calculated that these 220 people plus the volunteers have contributed around 600 hours of their time to collect these data. So usually when we think about volunteers, well, yeah, we could discuss if school kids are really volunteers. I would argue they are not. But anyway, if we talk about citizen science and the value to us as researchers, we often forget that they really do work out there, right? And 600 hours is quite a bit of work for a research project out in the field. Yeah, but maybe you're interested in the data that we found at lakes here around Halifax. So here you see one volunteer who's also present here in the audience today. This is one of the research methods we employ. You can see on the photos there's a square. The square has a total of 9 square meters, and we collect litter only within these squares. So we really know how much litter there's per square meter, and this value we can compare to other sites in the world. So we found on average almost 1 litter item per square meter. And then we do the squares at different locations, closer to the water or further away, and we found slightly more litter at the upper side of the lakes or beaches. This is something we have found at other sites as well. We think usually people sit down more like at the upper end of the beach, unless it's like a huge beach, but we haven't gone to these, and probably not sit down right at the water to eat snacks, for example. Then there's a second method. We just have a big tarp with a lot of different categories on it, and the people go out, collect as much litter as they can, and yeah, we sort the litter into individual categories. So we classified almost 3,000 litter items during these samplings. 50% of those were single-use plastics. Single-use plastic is basically any object that we only use once and then discard. Plastic bottles, snack wrappers, things like that. So everything that we use more than once, that is intended to be used more than once, doesn't fall into this category. And the individual category for which we found most litter items were, this plastic wrappers. About 1/5 of all litter related to this category. And we also weighted the stuff was a bit over 100 kilos. All right, so we have done this with 7 schools in Canada, but this project already existed in Germany. There, the plastic pilots, it's called plastic pilots over in Germany, and the plastic pilots look like this, by the way. So these are our German school kids doing a sampling. Usually we do it at rivers there because we have quite some lakes, but not as many as we have here in Nova Scotia. So there we go to the rivers. We do really similar methods. We just do circles instead of squares, but that's basically it. We find they are easier to establish. And yes, we have involved 1,500 schools there, a lot of people. It's running since 8 years, and we have involved about 25,000 school kids. Yeah, and this was more like of a PR sampling where we had a photographer on site and they were taking nice pictures and so on and so forth. So it's been funded there for quite a while. Hello, come in. No worries. Yeah, but then we don't only do it in Germany, we do it in quite some countries in Europe. So every country that is highlighted orange, we do it. We do this program in where it's called Plastic Pirates Go Europe. It's taking place in 13 European countries now. And we have basically a sister network down in Latin America. It's called the Científicos de la Basura, which translates to litter scientists. They have been doing it for ages, since 2007. So we basically, well, I worked in Chile for 3 years, and we took this project and imported it to Germany, basically, and now we exported it to Canada. So now we kind of have the Canadian plastic pirates, 7 schools participating. We really hope we can go on next year for a bit. Yes, so in total, I counted today, there are 23 countries involved. So yeah, it's I think we have a good coverage so far, and we are looking forward to extend it, but there are some challenges with extending it as well. So, for example, this arrow in between doesn't just happen like this. No, usually the kids, they are involved in the data collections, but then it's us researchers who do the data analysis, who get all the stuff together, who in the end write an academic paper about that. So there's a lot of effort involved in actually writing this, getting this thing done. And I could share a little bit more in the end if you're interested in that process specifically. But there's a lot of work involved here. And if you just go to another country, it's not a given that you will get valuable scientific output, basically. So, for example, here we did it with 7 schools, 2 further organizations, 9 sampling sites. I personally don't think that's enough data to already write a research paper about that. But I would imagine if we can get to 20 sampling sites, then it gets really close to where it's being valuable and enough information. To go to 20 different lakes sounds pretty good to me, I think. And maybe, Tony, we can talk about that later. Okay. So yeah, also in the process, I want to share a little bit about this process. So we write these papers, which is quite a process, as most of you know. Then we send it off to a journal, and there 2 or 3 or 4 other scientists look at our paper and say, oh, great job. Well, you can publish it in our journal. Or they say, I don't really know, you should put major work into that. Or they say, oh, no, it's not good. You cannot put it into our journal. So the first time we sent off our data from the school kids to a journal, this was the feedback we got. I know some of you have seen this already, but I want you to take a minute and read this. So this was the feedback of one referee of our paper. Did you read that, Wallace? Yes. I don't mind English because I speak like that as well. Yeah, what do you think? Maybe someone from the audience has like a reflection on that. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes, I think so. So they had an initial bias against people participating, I think. Like anyone can participate in research, and they are probably thinking, no, not really likely. But you are free to just describe the overall experience and put it in like an educational journal or something like that. That is what they seem to have suggested there. We managed to convince them and publish the paper. Yes, and we have published 4 research papers based on the data in Germany so far. You can look them up later if you want to. We have also published 2 meta-studies about our process, how we managed to publish our data. One really relates to the quality of the data the school kids collect, because that's usually the big question, right? How can we make sure that school kids do basically the same work as other researchers? And we put a lot of thought into how we can convince other researchers to accept that this can happen. And then we have also written a short article about our communication approach with the teachers, how we communicate, when we communicate, to bring this project to life, basically. So the bottom 2 publications are more reflecting our own processes. And I didn't bother to put on the publications from our Chilean colleagues, because all I counted today, they are 21. So they published a lot more output than we did based on the insights of the school kids. So they have 21 peer-reviewed publications, not in journals intended for school kids, but in really actual scientific journals. Which I think they are doing a great job at. Right. So I think we can say, yes, school kids can participate in research. It's not happening automatically. You have to put a lot of thought and work into that. But I think we can answer the first question of today with a yes. And then the second question is, can we do even more with this? Can we use the actual scientific output to get into policy making? Yeah, and I know that a lot of people in the audience, or some people in the audience, really worry about this question a lot. I want to take, because I'm not an expert, I just want to take more the collaborative aspect of that question and explore it a little bit. We're currently writing an article that my colleague, if he's fast enough, will submit next week. And I want to share some of our thought process behind this. So why do we want to involve people in policy making? And now we consider more like the European perspective. There was a nice study done that I discovered recently, and they asked people, how easy do you find to be involved in policy making? It could be any kind. They would just ask, how easy do you find it? And 46% of the respondents who live in countries of the European Union said, oh, in local politics, it's more or less easy. We don't know what they think about policy making. Could be elections, could be any other kind of involvement, petitions, and so on. But then they found that only 15% of the population say the same about European policy making. So in Europe, you have this kind of weird concept, right, that several countries get together and make laws together. And as you can imagine, it's being somewhere up there for a lot of citizens, and it does trickle down into their real life, but they don't feel really involved in this process. So I think that's why we need to get them involved somehow in policy making, so they feel more empowered. Because we all kind of saw what happens if citizens don't really feel included. I think, right, has been a trend in many countries in the past years. So something of a puzzle that is existing in Europe. Let's say one puzzle piece is our initiative with the school kids, which is called the Plastic Pirates, right? It's a citizen science project. It's on there in the scene of European initiatives going on. Then we have a puzzle piece called European legislation and directives. So these are laws by the European Union that member states have to implement. They have to, it's usually goals. So one goal could be, oh, let's establish a circular economy. This is a directive of the European Union, but the European Union doesn't tell the member states how they should be doing that. So they are kind of free to do that. This has advantages and disadvantages, of course. There are 27 European countries, and in some countries, some approaches won't work that you could use in other countries. That's the thought process behind that. Then we have the international, large-scale international goals, right? You probably heard of the Sustainable Development Goals. They are called SDGs here. Yeah, we want to live without poverty, without hunger, without a lot of different things, without a lot of pollution. So we try to tie this in there a little bit as well. And then you have other scientific projects going on in Europe. One of them is called EMODnet, which is basically trying to get all the plastic litter data into one place, because as you can imagine, some researchers do their stuff, others do their thing. I go out with the kids would do another thing. But then this is an entity trying to bring all this information together. So we included these 4 kind of initiatives that I want to talk a bit. And currently the situation, in our opinion, looks a bit like that. So we as the Plastic Pirates want to be part of legislation. We want the directives to consider our data. So, for example, they could adapt their plastic pollution directives according to what is happening out there in reality, right? But we find they don't accept our data. And I personally don't even know whom to speak to, right? Because who does these things and whatever. Then maybe they cannot consider them. Because they need certain indicators, right? They really need to know how much litter is there in a certain area. But then there are projects out there who just collect litter, categorize it, don't consider the area. So these are some of the mismatches going on, and we try to illustrate it with this small graphic. Where we want to get to is, of course, that all actors talk with each other, find out their needs and expectations, and collaborate on getting closer together so these puzzle pieces fit in. I think we are a long way off, but I suggest a tiny maybe approach where we can involve the citizen involvement in the directive. So there's a directive called the Water Framework Directive. It has a pretty simple goal. It says all waterways, all water bodies, and coastal waters in the European Union have to have a good status. And then the good status is defined a bit because it relies on the animals being there, assemblages of invertebrates, for example. They also assess how many pollutants are out there, and so on and so forth. Interestingly, they don't consider plastics at all. It's been, it's from the year 2000, so it's 24 years in place. They're currently discussing how to assess microplastics, the really small plastic particles, in this directive. Well, so the directive obliges all European member states to obtain this goal, but they are free how to do it. So Germany could decide, oh yeah, we are going to test at site A, B, C, and 1,000 sites, and we collect our data and evaluate if it has good status. And another country like Slovenia could say, oh yeah, we are a smaller country, we just do 100 sites, and so on and so forth. Interestingly, the text also says this: the success of this directive is really tied on working with the community and the local population, right? So there's a really high level European directive saying, oh, but we need community involvement, basically. Yeah, we kind of took this as an invitation to write a research article and suggest something. We are not the first ones by far who suggest that plastic pollution should be a part of this directive. There are a lot of people who have suggested that and also suggested how this could be implemented. Because now, in theory, it could happen that a water body is declared to have a good status, but it could be full of plastics because it's just not assessed. Right. So I have two suggestions, which are a bit like theoretical and explorative. We could use all the data that is out there to not start at zero, right? So if they should decide that plastic pollution should be assessed within this directive, there's a lot of information out there that they could use as a baseline, basically, to know, to identify maybe sites that are especially vulnerable, to see how it relates to the assemblage of organisms in the rivers or lakes or the coastal environment, and so on and so forth. So here's a map of Germany on the left and of Slovenia on the right. Both countries have been participating in the plastic pirates projects. You see a lot of dots on that map. These are all the sampling locations the plastic pirates kits have been going to. And well, I hope you can see that there are two different colors. It's a tiny bit small, I think. The orange dots are sites where sampling stations from the Water Framework Directive also exist within a radius of 1 kilometer. So that's about 30% of the sites. So 30% of the sites, that was a coincidence, more or less, right, so far. So the schools, they go wherever they can go because, I mean, they cannot go far. They usually don't have money for transportation. They just go to a site close to them. And then the Water Framework Directive has a lot of sampling stations established in Germany and Slovenia. And we found that they spatially overlap. Without making any effort, already 30% of the stations overlap within 1 kilometer, which we consider more or less the walking distance of school kids when they go to the sampling sites, without them having complaining too much. Right. So this is a suggestion. Basically, the data is out there from our project even. And then there are a lot of other initiatives that I didn't list today, but that also contributed already a lot of data. And now we're only talking about plastics, right? There are a lot of projects assessing other parameters of water quality, going out there, assessing the invertebrates, assessing other pollutants. So all this data, I think, could be somehow tied into this directive. The big question, I think, is related to data harmonization. How can we consider 20 different projects towards one goal? And we would basically need to develop some common indicator what a good status would mean based on the other projects contributing data? I think that's a really scientific question, and I personally think this can be resolved somehow, because a lot of projects already contribute scientific knowledge, and now basically just needs to be harmonized in a way that can inform a directive. The second suggestion is, why not make citizen science an integral part of the whole directive? Why not use the local knowledge of people who are out there every day, who know their riverside, who know their lakes? Why not involve them somehow, for example, to report plastic pollution hotspots? We had some kids going out with small sampling nets. We sent them to them by mail, and they put them in the river and tried to capture microplastics. And we found a lot of microplastics in rivers in Germany. I wouldn't have expected it. The net we sent out has a mesh size of 1 millimeter. So everything that is smaller than 1 millimeter, we cannot capture with that net. So some researchers would even argue we wouldn't call them microplastics. Some researchers say microplastics are less than 1 millimeter large. So we used that mesh size because the school kids would have too much work to handle any other mesh size that gets stuck with organic material. If it's too fine, then they have to sort through all this stuff. Well, anyway, they sent in the samples to our lab. We analyzed them. We also encouraged them to analyze that at school, but they all sent them in, and we found microplastics in half of the samples that they analyzed, which I think is a lot considering that we only captured the larger fraction. And in one sampling site, they captured 200 plastic particles, like small ones, small black and white styrofoam plastics, which was a huge surprise. The net has this size. They put it in the river for half an hour only. They depend on the flow velocity to get a lot of water through. And then they just send in their data and their sample without us telling much more. And then I looked up the sampling site on Google Earth and found out, oh, wow, there's Dow Chemicals right around the corner, a huge industry complex by Dow Chemicals. And it's not only Dow Chemicals doing stuff there, but a lot of other plastic, I almost said pollution, but producing industry. And on one of the websites, I found a product that really resembled our sample. It's probably meant as a kind of insulation for houses. So to insulate houses, they often use these small pellets, and probably they just got into the environment and into the river somehow. So this would be basically a second suggestion, right? Why not use people who are there anyway, who care about their local environment, to have to establish a kind of information flow between the people from the Water Framework Directive, the official monitoring bodies, and the people being out there and knowing the environment. I think this requires the establishment of communication pathways, maybe the involvement of people who have expertise in working with kids, working with general public. I think this is a really crucial part. So far, the government takes on all responsibility to monitor something, which also means they might not be really open to other people going in there, contributing data that might be controversial to their data collection practices. So I think it requires, to accept to renegotiate some power balances in the whole framework directive. And this is a really crucial thing. I think you could say, maybe they are really open and they say, oh yeah, let's involve citizens. And we just reduce the budget a bit for this whole thing because they are doing that work now. I don't think this should happen. So they have to be the ones being responsible. They are. It's a European directive. They have to implement that. But why not in a more meaningful way implement people being there? So for this, I think this whole thing, would have to go through this whole cycle. We have to make sure that citizen scientists could contribute data that we consider to be robust enough to be scientific knowledge. And then this scientific knowledge has to be somehow translated to become part of policy making. And we would have to go through that whole cycle with each iteration, right? With each, maybe even every contributor. They have to know what they are doing. They have to know why they are doing that. So I think that would be quite a setup. But just want to share some thoughts regarding this. And then finally, Again, the research question, I don't really know. I would hope so. The second one, I would really hope that people could contribute to policy making. There are case studies out there, so I think it is possible. And it also depends a lot of how you define involvement, right? Voting is involvement, but maybe it's even more meaningful to be out there in the field, to collect data, to send it off to a government agency, and they actually respond to you, asking you, have you been observing that for a long time? What could we do to make this situation a bit better, and so on and so forth. I think that would raise a lot of trust in people actually having a meaningful say in the policy-making process. I wanted to tie in these three persons you see here, the two citizen scientists, and what is that? Let's say it's a policymaker, into a bit of a larger framework. It's a big figure, but I want to try to guide you through it a bit. So let's say we have an environmental or societal problem on the top part of the figure, right? Could be plastic pollution, but also could relate to clean drinking water, could relate to climate change, or any pollutant that is out there, anything that causes problems. And then we have some people, which we call science actors, that are being motivated to investigate this problem, right? So in our case, this is a collaboration between citizen scientists and established scientists. When I use the term established scientists, some students gave me the feedback, it sounds like only old people doing science. So we might want to reconsider that term, but we have it in that figure now. So they kind of collaborate on making a scientific impact related to this project, right? Most of these groups communicate their results in different ways, I think. The citizen scientists may share their insights with family, may share it on social media. The researchers may share that as a scientific publication, as a scientific article. And if we are lucky, the traditional media picks up on that, could pick up more on the citizen involvement side, could pick up more the data. We were really successful in Germany because a media company was involved there, and we had thousands of articles posted about the plastic pirates. Sometimes it was just like this super local newspaper saying, oh, the kids go out and they find litter, and it's just a nice picture of them with all the litter. And sometimes it was quite extensive coverage by television. Sometimes television went with the kids. That was really nice. So we know it has been picked up in our case by something that is being called here traditional media. And these communication channels in turn could influence the general public, right? The opinion of the general public, who hopefully then can influence the decision makers to act on the initial environmental problem. So this is a bit our philosophy in approaching the plastic pirates. We have included this figure the first time in 2017 in an article and have been refining, redefining, discussing terminology a bit. So if you have feedback for that, please let us know. There are like 10 versions of this figure that we have been using, and this is the most recent one. Actually, it's not, but there are only tiny changes. But yeah, we really hope that the influence somehow, the tiny influence that we have on the general public and the decision makers makes in the end a small difference in addressing these environmental problems. I have one concluding slide and then we are done. I want to give you a short disclaimer. I was talking a lot about involving people in science, right? But I was talking, how can I involve them in science? I as a researcher. There are citizen science studies out there where it's the other way around, where citizen scientists basically discover something that is wrong in the environment. They want to care about it. And then they sometimes involve established researchers to investigate this more thoroughly, or they already investigating that and get back to academia to get some sort of input for more reliable methods. Because if you address policymakers and you didn't do a really good job in data collection, they are probably less likely to listen to you. So everything that I talked about is more like an institutional approach, right? I'm coming from academia. Also, the school system is a really institutionalized system. Here in Canada and Germany as well. When you go out there with the kids collecting litter, it doesn't seem like that. It seems sometimes like a chaotic mess. But it's actually super institutionalized. Some other people decide what they learn. We decide how we want to involve them. So our insights are a bit limited to this institutionalized interaction. Yeah, and then there's the big remaining questions. How do we even acknowledge the work of people, of the kids? Maybe you've seen when I presented the studies that we published, there were no names of the kids on there. I don't know the names of the kids. Sometimes because of issues of data privacy, right? But we could have maybe included the names of the teachers on our research publications. We decided we didn't want to do that. So you could also argue maybe that was a bad decision. We have included them in the acknowledgements. We have included a list of all the schools that participated. We've also included the schools that went out there but couldn't contribute in a meaningful way because there were some issues with the data collection for the effort, basically. But there's a big discussion, and I personally think there's no, well, maybe it's not enough of a discussion yet, but yeah, how do we really acknowledge the valuable and scientific work of so many people contributing to a project? And I think we still need to develop a bit of good practices to get them, to acknowledge them properly in the research work. All right, that's about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and I will keep my questions for a minute while I invite other people, both here in the audience and those online. Feel free to either put your questions into the text or to raise your hand, and we'll let you speak. So do you have?
We do have one question.
Okay.
Boris. There.
I'm not sure if I've got my speaker up now, Boris.
Yeah, I think that one was.
Does that work?
That works.
Yep. Okay, Boris,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, hi Tim. Fantastic presentation, really interesting. As you know, I'm working on similar issues with school children, but you seem to have an enormous reach with your initiative. You commented a little bit on the involvement of a media company. I'm just interested in how you got so many schools to participate. It's hard to do that here, I find. How did you do that in Germany to reach so many schools, and what was your distribution model, so to speak, for your initiative?
Yeah, we were really lucky. We were actually approached by the Federal Ministry of Education and Research in Germany to create this project. So we had their backup, and they sent us a list of all the schools that exist in Germany, and we sent out letters to 30,000 schools, postal mail, which the ministry paid for. Yeah, and then because we had such an initial mass, a lot of teachers told their colleagues, and we have been going on with that mass ever since. But this is a really crucial aspect of Citizen Science Project, this recruitment project, and it's really, yeah, you always have to reach a critical mass somehow. In our case, this was facilitated by the ministry, so we were really lucky there.
So education is at the federal level. Here it's provincial, so we have another.
Oh, we get that as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is a question referring on international treaties, negotiations. Are you I was curious to hear your opinion on this and general.
Yeah, so maybe the Global Plastics Treaty, for example, it's comparable to the climate negotiations, basically. No, it's something where the UN countries meet up frequently to discuss how we can end plastic pollution. I know that Tony has been quite involved in that. Yeah, I don't really know of any involvement of citizen scientists, because I personally think there's not even a lot of involvement of scientists. Last year, there were more lobbyists than researchers at this Global Plastic Treaty Convention. So I know that scientists can have a small say, but I've also heard from colleagues that it's even really hard to, as an established, using that term again, well, as a plastic pollution researcher who has done that since a long time, to be heard in these international conventions. So I wouldn't know of any involvement of the citizen science approach in that, but maybe Tony can say more.
Yeah, sure. I was going to ask a question anyway, but wanted others from the audience to ask. But to one of your questions, Great presentation, by the way. Super relaxed, excellent information that we all got to listen to. You know, the Great Canadian Shoreline Cleanup, there's about 30 years or thereabouts of data here in Canada. And that data collected by citizen scientists, some would have been kids going with their parents, I'm sure, over those 30 years, generated a reoccurring list called Canada's Dirty Dozen. And you know the top 12 single-use items on that list. Much of that data did actually make its way to the federal single-use plastic policy. And so in a way, there is that conversation. I don't know how the conversation starts, but that data was used as a line of evidence. So in some respects, it's working at the national level, if not even if it doesn't work at the global plastics treaty.
I often think data can somehow speak for itself because it has been like verified by other researchers, but actually the people who are involved in these projects, that would be really interesting to give them more of a voice, not only the output they create, but themselves. Yeah. Yes,
just a comment to follow up on what Senator Tone said. At least at the national level, there was a committee of the House of Commons, the Committee on Science and Research and STEM Committee, that held hearings on the topic of citizen science. So I would say that the people at that level are aware that this potentially can be useful. I was at the time when I was reading some of that, and it was about a year ago that committee held the hearings and reported. And I was looking particularly at bird counts, and people were reporting birding, which is another big citizen science initiative that's, because with the bird count from the Audubon Society has gone on since 1905 or thereabouts, and all of that data is filtering into, filtering is the wrong word, is flowing into eBird, which has, according to the executive director of eBird, 1 in 40 Canadians are involved, which means 1 million people are contributing to that. And there were questions from the MPs about the quality of the data. So it's the same sort of issues that you were talking about here. So at least there's some level of sense of the value of citizen science at the national level, whether that feeds directly into policy decisions. That was, I don't know whether that was part of the discussion. I must admit it didn't read the full report, but still, there is possibilities.
Yeah. Well, there are also studies out there showing that decision makers are, in theory, up for taking and considering up citizen science. But there's also a general lack of awareness that this exists and how to deal with this data on part of the decision makers. So there's the general availability of them to take up that data, but something in between is a bit missing oftentimes. Yeah. Yes.
There's a question.
Oh, yeah.
Do you also do research with students and teachers to find out what benefits young people derive from their involvement in science?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, the question, the question is if we somehow want to figure out what the teachers and school students also have from participating, as far as I understand, besides just collecting the research data, right?
Yeah. What benefits?
Yes. So the benefits I presented to you are theoretical benefits. I mean, we hope that it helps their scientific education and so on and so forth. There was a small project attached to the plastic pilots trying to find out this precisely, but then it was scrapped by the ministry, unfortunately, the funding for this. So we don't really know about the plastic pilots. There are a lot of citizen science initiatives who say, oh yeah, it can, or in this case, it furthered their environmental awareness. They are more caring now. There are other studies saying, oh yeah, it furthered their scientific literacy, but it's usually really project specific. And in this project, we really wanted to emphasize the educational component as well. We have created about 70-page booklet with educational material related to plastic pollution that we created together with the school teachers working in our school lab at Kiel University. And they went with the booklet to school, tried out the different exercises, came back to us. We improved on that and so on and so forth. Yeah, because I think in the educational context, it can only go together, the research and education. But unfortunately, we didn't manage to investigate that for the plastic pilots itself.
So are you saying they did initially track it and then they decided not?
Oh, well, yeah, we had the big questionnaire sent out to
Yeah.
teachers. They participated, but then there was no funding left for analyzing these results, unfortunately.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. That would be a next step we need to take. I have to admit I have zero experience in doing that. Yeah, so this is another thing where probably some other people need to get involved to make this transition happen. Can be a bit part of the way. Maybe the paper we are currently working on suggesting some involvements of citizen scientists in the Water Framework Directive could be considered to be a policy brief of some sort, but then I know there are specific policy briefs and we have not published any of that yet. Yeah, the Chileans were much more active on that side. They have actually kind of a small evidence that their data was considered in the decision-making process of banning plastic bags from Chilean supermarkets. They only wanted to ban them in supermarkets located in coastal cities. And then the prof I'm working with over in Chile, they set up a letter gathering support saying that it should be forbidden in all of the cities. Yeah, because it doesn't really make sense, no, to only have it in coastal cities. And the decision was flipped and then it was forbidden in entire Chile. But of course, we don't really know what was the final thought process behind that. Yeah.
And I want to respect people's time, so we'll take one more question formally, and then if you
Yes,
have time.
of
we
course,
can do one.
yes.
Yeah, just a quick question.
We basically were really honest afterwards on which data we included and which data we rejected from our study. I think, yeah, now I think everyone should do that, but you probably know when you go out to the field, the first 2 times you go out there, something happens, and then you are just like, oh, I won't consider this data. And if you're really transparent, you mentioned that in a research article, but maybe you don't. So for the plastic pirates, we actually published a list of reasons why we couldn't use the data. For example, we said, oh, this schools didn't really send us the coordinates of the sampling sites. And when we got in contact with the teachers, we couldn't really clarify this issue. Maybe the teacher had moved away. Maybe they, I don't know, went out twice and confused the sampling sites and we couldn't solve this issue. So we included a list in the paper saying 300 schools participated. Of those schools, we used 180 data sets. The others 30 were excluded for this reason, another 30 for that reason. I think that made a good impression on the reviewers to really say why the data had to be excluded. Yeah, that was one thing. One of the studies we published really relates to that aspect. So if you're really interested in that, we have different data quality mechanisms in the projects. Yeah. Thank you.
And if you've got good quality data, it doesn't matter if you're a citizen scientist or an established researcher. Even established researchers have dodgy data.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think you make the argument.
Yeah.
Well, this was, as everyone has stated, this was a really enlightening and fun and very beautiful presentation.
Thank
We
you.
love the slides. So on behalf of
Oh,
the
thank
part,
you.
thank
so
you
much.
very much. And people can feel free. I think this room's probably available.
Yes.
So we will, let people informally chat, and certainly for those online, you can feel free to follow up.
Yes.
So thank you very much.